right, so imagine this. Late 1970s. Sun beating down,
Yeah.
Middle Egypt, you got like a forgotten cave, right? And then some local peasants, they find these ancient writings.
So it sounds like a movie, doesn't it?
Total adventure flick.
Yeah.
Yeah. But actually, that's where we're starting today.
Yeah.
A real discovery. A text that, well, tells a very different story about one of history's most infamous figures.
Yeah, for nearly 2,000 years, Judas Iscariot has basically been known for the ultimate betrayal. That label, I mean, it carries a lot of weight, but what if there's more to the story?
Right.
Like, what if in those early days of Christianity, there was a whole other perspective, one that completely flips the script on Judas?
Okay, so that's exactly where we're going today. Deep diving into, well, the lost gospel of Judas Iscariot. This text was rediscovered pretty recently, and it shines a totally new light on Judas. And, you listening right now, you've probably got a pretty solid idea of who you think Judas was. But get ready, because we're going to challenge that, based on what this historical document actually says.
Our guide for this exploration is Bart D. Ehrman.
Okay, yeah.
He wrote this really insightful book on this topic. Ehrman's a leading scholar in early Christianity, the New Testament, and he actually got to examine this manuscript firsthand, the fragile thing.
So our mission is pretty clear then, right? We're going to break down those key differences between the Judas we see in the New Testament Gospels and the Judas we find in this rediscovered gospel. And then we want to see what are the possible historical and theological implications of this new perspective. Okay, so first things first. How did this ancient manuscript, hidden for so long, reappear?
The story of its discovery, it's got that dramatic flair, right? Like those other big archaeological finds, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library. So, back in 1978, near these cliffs, Jebel Karara in Egypt, some locals were exploring ancient burial caves.
Treasure hunters, basically.
Yeah, you could say that. They stumbled on this collection of papyrus codices, and that's where the Gospel of Judas was, hidden all that time.
Wow. It's kind of wild to think about. These words, silent for centuries, and then boom, they're back in the world. And Ehrman himself, he actually got to see and study this thing.
Yeah, December 2004, Ehrman, he was in this conservation studio. It was just outside Geneva, Switzerland. He talks about feeling exhausted, but also super excited. And the whole thing was like shrouded in secrecy, which just made it feel even more important.
So paint us a picture. What did this manuscript look like? I know it's 62 pages of papyrus, and it was part of a bigger collection of texts, right?
That's right. It wasn't just the Gospel of Judas. It was bound together with a few other early Christian writings, like an anthology. Two of these were text scholars already knew about. The letter of Peter to Philip and the first apocalypse of James. Those had actually been found at Nag Hammadi. But the third text, that's the one that got everyone's attention. This previously unknown gospel with Judas's name on it.
And this wasn't like the original, right? It's a copy from the 4th century CE.
Yeah, the actual manuscript, it's written in Coptic, dates back to the 4th century. But the language, the content, they suggest it's a translation of an earlier Greek text, probably from the mid-2nd century. And this is where it gets really interesting. Around 180 CE, Irenaeus, one of the early church fathers, he wrote about a gospel of Judas. He says certain Christian groups, ones he considered heretical, were using it. These were the Gnostics.
Right.
It's very likely that the manuscript we have today is a copy of that very same gospel. So from the get-go, this text was caught up in those early Christian debates, who's in, who's out, that kind of thing.
So almost right away, this perspective on Judas was considered, outside the mainstream?
Mm-hmm.
But with a document this old, with such a journey after its discovery, were there ever doubts about it being real? Could it have been a fake?
Ehrman, he's spent his career looking at ancient manuscripts, spotting fakes. And he's pretty much said there's almost no chance it's a forgery. The material, the writing, the language, they all point to it being authentic from ancient times.
That's a big deal. But the manuscript, it went through a lot after being found, didn't it? It wasn't exactly in perfect condition after all that time in the Egyptian desert.
Oh, yeah, big time. After it was found in 78, it kind of disappeared into the shady world of antiquities dealers, Egypt, the U.S., Switzerland. And get this, they reportedly froze and thawed the papyrus multiple times, trying to preserve it.
Oh, wow.
Ironic, right? Because that made the papyrus super brittle. It started breaking apart. So by the time experts got to it, those 62 pages were a mess. Hundreds of pieces all mixed up. And they think maybe 10 to 15% of the text is just gone. Poof, lost forever. So scholars like Rodolphe Casser, they had a massive job ahead of them. Restoration and translation, like putting together a shattered vase, but with some pieces missing.
Sounds incredibly delicate, painstaking. And I read that there was even a mix-up with some of the fragments early on.
Oh, yeah. At first, some pieces were misidentified. They thought they were from a different Gnostic treatise. This one was about a figure called Elogenes. It took years of careful work piecing together those tiny fragments for experts like Florence Darbre and the Coptologist Rudolf Kasser to realize what they really had. The latter part of the codex wasn't just the near-complete Gospel of Judas. It also had these remaining pieces of the Elogenes text.
Gotcha.
So correcting that mix-up was key to understanding everything in the manuscript.
So you've got this incredible, if fragile, link to the 2nd century, maybe even to the text that was controversial back then. But to really get how radical this lost gospel is, we need to revisit the story most of us know, the classic Judas story. So let's talk about Judas in the New Testament Gospels.
Right.
Where does that traditional understanding come from?
Our earliest written accounts of Judas come from the New Testament Gospels. They were written, 35 to 65 years after the events they describe?
Yeah.
But it's important to remember, these aren't like objective historical reports. Each gospel writer had their own theological goals, their own style, and that shaped how they told the story, including how they portrayed Judas. So even within these foundational texts, you don't get one fixed historical account, you get interpretations. Each author has their own agenda, even when it comes to such a central figure.
Right. It's not one single story. So how do the different Gospels actually portray Judas and why he portrays Jesus? What are his motives?
Well, Mark, that's the earliest gospel. It doesn't actually give a specific reason for the betrayal. Matthew adds the 30 pieces of silver, right? Suggesting Judas was greedy and also framing it as fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. Then Luke, he goes even further, says Satan is directly influencing Judas. The betrayal is part of this cosmic battle of good versus evil. In John's gospel, that's probably the most negative. Judas is dishonest from the start. John even calls him a devil. So you can see how the portrayal of Judas changes across these texts.
It's a pretty big range, right? From no clear reason in Mark to, like, demonic possession in Luke and John. And it's interesting how Jesus himself is portrayed differently in those same Gospels.
Absolutely. In Mark, Jesus is often more human. He expresses anguish, doubt. Matthew's Jesus is clearly fulfilling those Jewish messianic prophecies. Luke emphasizes Jesus' compassion, his focus on the marginalized. And John's Jesus is practically divine. His heavenly origins are always there. And these different portrayals of Jesus, they affect how we understand Judas's actions. For example, if Jesus is all-knowing, divine, then Judas's betrayal might be seen as part of God's plan, even if Judas is still to blame.
And then there's Peter and Judas. They both fail Jesus, but their stories go in such different directions.
Totally different paths. Both of them have these huge moments of failure. Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times, right?
Right.
But in Mark's gospel, there's a hint that Peter can be forgiven. After the crucifixion, the women at the tomb, they're told to tell his disciples and Peter that Jesus has risen. He'll meet them in Galilee. It suggests Peter can be restored. But Judas, well, he pretty much vanishes from Mark's account after the betrayal. Jesus had said earlier it would have been better for Judas not to have been born. That's a pretty grim outlook. Matthew adds the detail of Judas feeling remorse and then killing himself by hanging after Jesus condemns him. But it's interesting, Luke's gospel doesn't mention Judas's death at all. And then the book of Acts gives a totally different account. Judas falls headfirst, his body bursts open.
So even the end of Judas' story, it changes within the New Testament itself. It really shows how much of what we think we know is based on interpretation, not one historical account. So what solid facts about Judas can we actually pull from the Gospels?
The Gospels all agree on a few basic things. His name was Judas Iscariot. He was one of the 12 disciples, and he played a role in handing Jesus over to the Romans. But beyond those basics, a lot of the details about why he did it, what happened to him in the end, that's all open to interpretation. It's shaped by each gospel writer's perspective.
Okay, so that sets the stage for what the Gospel of Judas does. It flips the script on Judas. So how does it portray him?
It's a complete reversal. In the Gospel of Judas, Judas is not the villain. He's not driven by greed or demons. Instead, he's Jesus's closest disciple, the one who truly understands Jesus's divine nature. He actually acts according to Jesus's specific instructions. So in a way, he becomes a key player in Jesus's ultimate mission, but in a way that's totally different from the traditional story.
Wow, that's a huge shift. The ultimate betrayer becomes the most trusted friend. So what are the first lines of this gospel? What do they tell us about it?
It starts like this. The secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot during a week, 3 days before he celebrated Passover. Right away, you see the emphasis on secret account and revelation. It's not meant to be a public story like a historical record. It's about hidden knowledge that Jesus shares with just one disciple.
And what kinds of conversations does Jesus have with the disciples, especially Judas? Are they like the scenes in the New Testament?
The interactions are quite different. In one scene, Jesus laughs at the other disciples. They don't understand his true origins, and they're afraid of earthly powers. This is a classic Gnostic idea. There's a spiritual elite who has true knowledge, and then there's everyone else who's clueless. Then there's this vision of the temple sacrifices. In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus doesn't see them as true acts of worship. He says they symbolize the disciples themselves, portrayed as these misguided teachers being sacrificed in his name by the religious authorities who don't get his message. And then Judas has his own vision. He sees himself being stoned by the other disciples and then entering this incredible house. Jesus explains that this vision shows what will happen to Judas and represents that spiritual realm reserved for the truly enlightened, a place regular people can't access.
So we're already seeing some big differences from the familiar gospel stories, but it seems like the core of the Gospel of Judas is that secret revelation Jesus gives to Judas. What's in that revelation?
That teaching is the heart of the gospel. It explains this whole Gnostic understanding of the cosmos and humanity's place in it. It describes a creation myth that involves this supreme, invisible, spiritual realm and these lesser divine beings, sometimes called eons. And according to this view, the material world, humanity, they weren't created by that ultimate God. They were created by lower, ignorant, even kind of evil entities, beings like Nibro, also known as Yaldabaoth, and Seklas. And this is a big one. The God of the Old Testament, El, is presented as one of those lesser, flawed creators.
Wow.
So in this framework, salvation doesn't come from having your sins forgiven, like in traditional Christianity. It comes from getting this secret knowledge, this gnosis, that lets your soul escape this flawed material world and go back to that true divine realm. So basically for Gnostics, the problem wasn't sin, it was being stuck in the material world. So this changes how we understand Jesus' death.
Okay, so it's a totally different cosmology, right? A different God, a different creation. And how does all this relate to Judas and what happens to Jesus in this story?
Within this Gnostic context, Jesus tells Judas to sacrifice the man that clothes me. He's basically asking Judas to help him escape his physical body.
Right.
The body is seen as this temporary thing, even a hindrance. So it's an act of liberation, helping Jesus go back to the divine realm, not betrayal in the way we usually think of it.
And how is the actual moment of handing Jesus over depicted? Is it similar to the New Testament accounts?
There are some surface similarities, but the motivation, the context, they're totally different. It doesn't happen in the Garden of Gethsemane. It happens in a guest room.
Right.
The Jewish high priests and scribes, they're there, and they want to arrest Jesus secretly. They're afraid of his followers who see him as a prophet. Judas does receive money, but he's doing it because Jesus told him to. He's helping Jesus escape his physical form.
And maybe the biggest difference.
Yeah.
What happens after Judas hands Jesus over? Does it follow the traditional story? Arrest, trial, crucifixion, resurrection?
Nope, this is where the Gospel of Judas really goes its own way. The story basically ends with Jesus being handed over. No trial, no crucifixion, no resurrection. And that makes sense if you understand the Gnostic view of salvation. It's about the spirit escaping the body. It's not about Jesus dying and rising physically. It's about his divine essence being freed from the material world. Because for Gnostics, the physical body was like a prison for the spirit. So salvation wasn't about the body coming back to life, like in mainstream Christianity. That's why the Gospel of Judas ends with Jesus' spirit being liberated, not with him returning in physical form.
So this gospel shows us a very different early Christian worldview. You've mentioned that it's Gnostic, so for those who don't know, who were the Gnostics?
The Gnostics were all these different early Christian groups. They were around in the first few centuries CE. Their beliefs were pretty different from what eventually became mainstream Christianity, what we call Orthodox Christianity.
Okay.
A lot of Gnostic groups believe that salvation comes from having this special secret knowledge. They called it gnosis. It was about knowing the true nature of reality, the divine. They often had this dualistic view of the world. There's the spiritual realm, which is good and true, and then there's the material world, which is flawed, maybe even evil, created by these lesser divine beings. They didn't see God the same way either. They often believed in a supreme God, a God beyond the creator God in the Old Testament. Think of these eons as like emanations or aspects of that divine in the higher spiritual realm. And Yaldabaoth and Saklas, they're examples of those lesser creator deities in some Gnostic systems. They're the ones who created this imperfect material universe.
Gotcha.
So this Gnostic view is totally different from how Orthodox Christianity sees God, right? One God, all-powerful, all-good, creator of everything. And as we've seen, it changes how we understand Jesus' mission and what Judas did.
So how does the Gospel of Judas fit into all of this? Was this positive view of Judas a common thing among Gnostics?
Remember we talked about Irenaeus, he wrote against heresies around 180 CE. Well, he condemned certain Gnostic groups and mentioned this Gospel of Judas that portrayed Judas favorably, suggesting he had special knowledge. The Gospel we have today matches that description pretty well, so it's probably the same text. Its focus on secret knowledge, the dualistic worldview, how it interprets creation, it all points to Gnosticism. Now, not every Gnostic group would have had the same exact view of Judas,
Right.
but the idea of certain individuals having deeper spiritual understanding, that was common. And elevating figures who were seen as bad guys in the Orthodox story, that wasn't unheard of either.
Some scholars have debated whether the type of Gnosticism in the Gospel of Judas is an earlier or later form, haven't they?
Yeah, early on, some scholars thought it might be a more, primitive form of Gnosticism because some of its mythology seems simpler than what you see in later Gnostic texts, like those found at Nag Hammadi, the Secret Book of John, for example. But nowadays, scholars don't really see Gnosticism as developing in a straight line. It's more likely that different groups develop their own ideas, their own myths, at the same time with varying degrees of complexity. So the Gospel of Judas shares core Gnostic ideas, but its specific cosmology might be from one particular branch within that broader movement.
You mentioned connections to other Gnostic texts like the Secret Book of John and the Gospel of Thomas. What similarities do you see?
There are a few recurring themes, secret knowledge being the key to salvation, that's central to many Gnostic texts. We also see Jesus interacting with his disciples in ways that show they don't really understand, except for a select few. And in some Gnostic texts, Jesus' appearance is described as fluid, changing. Sometimes he looks like a child or even a phantom. This reinforces the idea that his physical form wasn't his true essence. Very different from how the canonical Gospels portray Jesus.
So in the Gospel of Judas, Judas isn't just innocent, he's actually really important. What does his role signify?
In this story, Judas is the hero. He's the one Jesus trusts with these profound truths that the others just don't get. He has the courage and understanding to carry out Jesus' true will, even though it looks like betrayal from the outside. It's a total contrast to how Judas is portrayed in later Christian tradition. There, he's all about greed, treachery, even linked to demons. His image was even used to fuel anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
It's a complete reversal in this theological framework.
Wow, a radical reevaluation of someone who's been condemned for centuries. But what about the actual Judas, the person who walked with Jesus? Can this gospel tell us anything about him?
Figuring out the historical Judas is a tough one for scholars, but some scholars suggest that Jesus and his early followers, including Judas, probably believed in Jewish apocalyptic ideas.
Jewish apocalypticists.
Yeah.
For those of us who don't know, what did they believe?
This is a big movement in the centuries around when Jesus lived. They believed that God was going to intervene in history very soon, that he would end the current evil age and bring about this new era of justice and peace. They called it the kingdom of God. They thought there would be these cosmic battles between good and evil, with God ultimately winning, rewarding the righteous, punishing the wicked.
And how does Jesus, as he's portrayed in the Gospels, fit into that apocalyptic framework?
The earliest Gospels, especially Mark and Matthew, they're full of Jesus talking about the coming kingdom, the judgment, and the role of the Son of Man and all of that. He says the kingdom is at hand, even suggests it'll arrive while some people alive then are still living. These are classic apocalyptic ideas.
So if Jesus and his followers believed all that, how might we understand what Judas did?
Well, if Judas believed God's kingdom was coming soon, and he was one of the 12 chosen to rule in that kingdom, which Matthew and Luke mention, maybe his betrayal came from misunderstanding how that kingdom would actually arrive. Maybe he expected God to intervene more directly, more forcefully, like overthrowing Roman rule.
Okay.
But Jesus talked about suffering, death, a different kind of spiritual kingdom. Maybe that clashed with those more traditional messianic expectations.
Yeah.
And maybe that led Judas to, I don't know, get disillusioned or try to force Jesus' hand. Some scholars have suggested that based on hints in the canonical Gospels.
And that brings us back to orthodoxy and heresy. The Gospel of Judas, with its different interpretation, it was seen as heretical by the early church. What does this tell us about how Christian beliefs developed?
The terms orthodoxy and heresy, they came from all the disagreements and different interpretations within early Christianity. Scholars like Bauer have argued that early Christianity was a lot more diverse than we often think. There wasn't one set of beliefs everyone agreed on. Different groups had different perspectives, different texts they liked. The Gospel of Judas, with its unique theology, it represents one of those alternative viewpoints. And it was eventually rejected, excluded from what became the accepted orthodoxy. That's why it was suppressed and basically forgotten until it was rediscovered.
It's amazing how a text considered heretical can give us such a valuable glimpse into those early centuries. So as we wrap up our deep dive, what are the key takeaways you'd want our listeners to remember about the Gospel of Judas?
The big one is that this gospel offers a radically different story. Judas isn't the ultimate betrayer. He's Jesus' trusted confidant, acting according to Jesus' will within this Gnostic framework. It really challenges the traditional view of Judas and shows us how diverse early Christian beliefs really were.
And for you listening, we hope this deep dive has given you a richer understanding of this fascinating part of early Christian history. It's a reminder to look beyond the familiar stories and consider different perspectives.
Yeah, and this brings up an important question. How does the existence of the Gospel of Judas, with its radical interpretation of Judas, change how you see the development of Christianity? Does it make you rethink other figures in religious history who have been called villains or heretics? We encourage you to explore Gnosticism and other early Christian texts that weren't included in the Bible. There's a whole world of fascinating, often surprising ideas out there.
Definitely worth checking out.
Absolutely.
All right, well, until next time, keep diving deep.
And keep questioning.